fall, and somebody else who does fall spring, and that way the continuity over the summer. And
Actually,
it's
there's no more inherent politics than
head start. So we start actually planning the previous semester, because otherwise, you're inviting people last minute, and it just all the external folks. And you really want to bring people involved. It's a better time to visit. Because spring kind of sucks in a way because everybody's got everything going. You only have really half the semester. Maybe the first half you can't.
It's pretty here in the fall.
Yeah.
So you're going to say something first.
So it's important.
All right. So we're going to get started for today. Thank you, Saul. So we have Kieran Healy joining us today, and to introduce him, we have Daniel.
Yeah, so it's really a pleasure and honor to introduce Kieran Healy, who we've wanted to get here for our seminar for a while, since he's just down the road at Duke. It turns out he's in New York this year, but anyways, he flew down anyways. He's a professor of sociology at Duke. His PhD is from Princeton University. If you are working with me or have even had a conversation with me, it's likely I've recommended one of Kieran's books. I've been a fan of his for a while. I want to say a little bit about his previous works. His first book, entitled Last Best Gifts, Altruism and the Market for Human Blood and Organs, examines the social organization of blood and organ donation in Europe and the United States. And he takes the sort of core insight that you could trace to Karl Polanyi or earlier of economic sociology, that the rational maximizing actor of economics is really something that's a historical invention and needs institutions in order to actually function, and takes that logic and applies it to the non-economic altruistic actor, and shows that that actor, and even the distinction between the maximizing market actor and the altruistic actor really depends on institutions, on sort of an institutional infrastructure. It's an amazing book, and really ultimately gives us a nice, compelling social theory of altruism. Fittingly, the book, I love this, the book received the Outstanding Book Award from the Association for Research on Nonprofit Organizations and Voluntary Action. How could they not? His second book, in a very different vein, Data Visualization, A Practical Introduction, is an accessible primer to how to create effective graphics from data. And it doesn't just discuss how to make good, legible, eye-catching graphics, but how to do it using R. And so anyone who's afraid to code and doesn't think they can code, who wants to do graphical displays, which we don't do enough in STS, definitely check out that book. It's also his fourth book because the second edition is just about to come out. More recently, Kieran co-authored The Ordinal Society, which is the title of his talk today. So I won't give it away, but I want to say that I see it as one of the few works that really sort of breaks the spell of AI, rather than hyping up the wonders or the apocalyptic dangers of AI. It asks what, not AI, but puts it within the context of digital capitalism. What digital capitalism is really doing right now. It's there in the hands of real developers and users, that we should think about the hazards and possibilities of those technologies. So please join me in welcoming Kieran Healy.
Thank you very much for that very generous introduction, Dan. And thanks for the opportunity to speak, and to everybody for coming. It's been great to meet and also catch up with people. I can't believe I have not been up here before. I regret now that it's taken this long. I'm the one who's physically present, but as Dan just mentioned, this is all joint work with Marion Fourcade at UC Berkeley. The Ordinal Society, the book, is one of the main results to come out of work we've been doing together for a distressingly long time now, and continue to do. The book is a sort of slightly unusual, maybe sort of old-fashioned book, slightly immodest book, although it's based on both of our long-term engagement with empirical case studies. It's not a monograph. Instead, it tries to propose a way of thinking about and an argument about the existing and likely consequences of the digitization of all social relations. So it's a big picture book. And I can't present the whole thing, and you'd be sorry if I tried. But today I'll just give a sketch of the main argument and extend things into more recent ongoing work that we're doing that's not in the book, focusing on the kind of individual that we think sort of the Ordinal Society wants to exist or can exist in such circumstances. But let's begin somewhere closer to the beginning. On terrain, probably that many of you know better than I do. In the mid-1950s, IBM were about to sell a new kind of computer into the French market, the IBM Model 650. And they'd already launched it to great success in the United States. The 650 was the first mass-produced computer, something that wasn't a one-off, that wasn't aimed at the state or scientific research, but that was specifically designed as a product to be sold to businesses. And the problem faced by IBM France was, what should it be called? Not the specific device itself, but the whole class of machine that it represented. And an obvious option was calculateur, the literal French translation of computer. It's good that Marion's not here, because making me speak French in front of Marion is an act of symbolic violence against us both. But IBM wanted something that conveyed more than just arithmetic. They knew that introducing neologisms into the French language is a hairy business. So they wrote to Jacques Perret, a classics professor at the Sorbonne, and asked him what they should call it, and that's his reply on the right there. And so, dear sir, he writes, how about ordinateur? It's a correctly formed word. It's even found in Lettré, the standard French dictionary, as an adjective designating God who brings order to the world. But he says that theological usage isn't that frequent anymore, so it would be fine if you called it the ordinateur. And then he goes on and he says, reading the brochures that you gave me, I see several of your devices have these feminine names, like trieuse and tabulatrice, and ordinatrice would be perfectly possible. And my preference would be to go for l'ordinatrice électronique. And of course, the gendered reference isn't entirely inappropriate, as everyone in this room absolutely knows. Until the mid-20th century, the term computer meant an office clerk, usually a woman, performing calculations by hand, and that's what early programmers were also disproportionately women, with the help of a mechanical device. IBM's new machine, though, was intended for general information processing, and so IBM France chose the masculine, godlike version to prevail instead, and the term entered the French of a couple of large fridges, and the accompanying power supply was about as big again. And the first one was installed in the controller's office of the old John Hancock building in Boston, the headquarters of the John Hancock Mutual Life Insurance Company, in 1954. And its job was to calculate sales commissions for the company's 7,000 or so insurance agents. And the 650, as I say, was a big success. IBM initially thought they might make about 50 of them, and then they ended up selling more than 2,000, which is not impressive in current dollars. And so what drove sales to IBM's kind of initial surprise was the variety of its commercial applications, which it's kind of funny that they were surprised. It's a general purpose computer. But it was put to work to run payrolls, manage inventory, analyze sales, control costs. And its hardware was quickly augmented by this thing, which is the RAMAC, which is the first commercial disk drive. And it could store about 3 3/4 megabytes of data. And unlike systems that were based on punch cards that came before it, it could access that data right away, and like much, much faster than punch cards. And that enabled a novel form of real-time processing of data. Air traffic control was an early application of it. But it also allowed companies to do things like look up client records immediately if they're on the phone with an agent or something, and decide on the spot, for example, whether to offer a policy or a credit line to somebody. And the acronym RAMAC stands for Random Access Method of Accounting and Control. And from then on, the breadth and depth of computerized data endlessly expands, and the paper records and handbooks of the late 19th century become the relational databases of the late 20th. And we know, of course, that there's lots of continuity here, right? Much of this descends from earlier revolutionary controlled innovations of the 19th century and before, from double entry bookkeeping in 15th century Italy down to the Brooks file letter cabinet and the filing cabinet and the card index liberate record keeping from bound volumes and allow for searching and tabulation in all kinds of ways, right down to the original IBM device, the Hollerith tabulation machine that was developed by Herman Hollerith to process US Census returns. But while the 650, continued this lineage, it accelerated it by massively generalizing its powers and really did give rise to something new. So the phone you have in your pocket, or maybe you're discreetly checking under the table, is a spiritual descendant of that machine. And we're used to the idea by now, and again, in an STS audience, everybody is aware of this, that over the past 70 years, computers have gotten faster and faster, smaller and smaller, but their real power lies in how they link the ordinary choices that we make into systems that constantly adjust and modulate themselves. So think, for example, of people deciding which restaurant to go to and how to get there. And they choose with the assistance of Google Maps or Apple Maps, and the map shows their position, many options for their destination. The locations all have descriptions and ratings associated with them that enters directly into the choice process if you're texting or if you're physically co-present just deciding what to do. Perhaps you'll be offered a coupon or some other deal that tell you how busy the place is. And once a choice is made, the phone helps you find the most effective route there, monitoring the position of your car, receiving information about the general flow of traffic, the state of the weather, the presence of accidents or speed traps, and so on as you make your way. And in navigating that flow, drivers also constitute it. As transportation planners like to say, right, these commuters are not in traffic, they are traffic. And their phones track them individually while also aggregating all this information about the global state of things using data from thousands of beacons like theirs. And some of that information from the network's eye view of things gets fed back down to the user, aiding individual drivers, helping them choose the right route. But, of course, that information also modulates the overall system by prompting drivers as they make their individual decisions. Would you like to accept a faster route or stay in your present course? A speed trap is reported ahead. The next off-ramp is temporarily closed. Sometimes the mode of control takes the form of reassurance. There is a 20-minute delay, but you're still on the fastest route. Don't get any fancy ideas like thinking you know a shortcut. The individual user relies on that information flowing through their phone to make their choices and decisions, which then feed again back into the overall system. Now, what's true of people in the role as drivers is also true in their role as diners and 1,000 other social activities now. Data about the flow of choices is used to update and enhance a system's global view of its own state. And once the meal is done, guests might decide to leave a review of the restaurant, to rate the driver that brought them there. On the way home, they might check to see if the selfie that they took has gotten any likes or shares from there. It's more than just like some abstract flow of information. And it's more than a means of surveillance, and it's more than just a price mechanism. Rather, it's as if the air traffic control and insurance price commission functions of the IBM 650 have been sort of fused, shrunk, and wholly generalized. And that's the real computing revolution, right? That's much of what we do is now immediately authenticated as we do it, stored as data, classified or scored on some sort of scale, and then deployed in real time to modulate some outcome of interest, usually the behavior of a person or a machine or an organization. And so that's ordinalization. Rank ordering processes powered by behavioral data, processed by computers, deployed to manage systems. And it increasingly forms the basic infrastructure by which the distribution of opportunities, the allocation of goods, and the circulation of knowledge takes place. So the introduction of the 650 was part of a socio-technical transformation whose implications we're still struggling to understand. And over the past 70 years, the rise in the scope of data collection and analysis has just radically reorganized how we experience and make our own lives. It's through their ability to observe, judge, and manage people across these different social domains that the ordinateurs exert their most significant influence on society. Everywhere, the bureaucratic logic of organizations merges with the calculative logic of machines, feeding on the data emitted by ever smaller and more powerful devices that ended up first in the workplaces, and then in the homes, and then on the laps, and then in the pockets, and then on the bodies of ordinary people, literally billions of people. So from that massive information, ordinateurs spit out scores and create difference, define priorities, organize queues, and in general provide a tremendously useful and powerful basis for action, for doing things. And they create order in that process by categorizing people things and ideas, and then by ranking and matching them to one another, to social positions, goods and services, prices. And so this argument is about classification and hierarchy and the intersection between the two. And the resulting patterns are what we think of as social structure, a sort of an ordinal society then, where computer-generated outputs become guideposts for choices. Now, in practice, the new methods are associated with all kinds of problems. From messy intractability of data, anyone who's ever worked with real data knows how awful it is, to spurious correlations, to opaque rules, outright discrimination. But still, these tools march forward, one step at a time, one fix at a time across the institutional landscape. Falling costs of storage, software, cloud computing, as well as weak legal protections have pushed organizations of all kinds to sweep up fine-grained data about people and things. And they know they're supposed to. We call this the data imperative. Organizations have an institutional sort of a sense that they should be doing this. Data collection is highly desirable. And the presumption is that eventually there'll be a reason to use it, that you'll accumulate a data lake that you can put to work somehow. And sometimes that turns out to be the case. Consider, for example, last year controversy that Google leaked out of Google about whether they were going to use all of that, those Google Docs data to train their own AI systems, for example. It's just sitting there on their servers. So we see these processes everywhere, at home and at work, setting wages and work schedules. And we see them deciding or being incorporated into calculation of rents, insurance, eligibility for social services. They mediate the distribution of knowledge, organize social influence, and affect the logic of political mobilization. Those last parts will be the main focus today. So how did this all happen? Well, I'm not going to try to tell the whole story, but one thing I do want to sort of emphasize as part of a broader story is that nobody really directed its genesis. In the process of insuring themselves against risk and applying for a loan or a job or benefiting from some special deal, people found it both compelling and necessary to produce more and more detailed information about themselves. Now, of course, a good deal of that transfer was weakly voluntary at best. If you want life insurance, you have to fill out a form, a detailed health survey, maybe visit a doctor. Whether you get a job might depend in part now on an algorithm picking your CV out of a pile. The hiring process might include an automated evaluation of your personality or on job suitability, generated again from some AI-run video, for example, that will be scored of you, that will be scored for various traits. But many other forms of incorporation into this new world were much more open and pleasant, even delightful. And this is often, I think, underestimated, certainly in my field. So social theorists tend to underestimate the importance of delight. General purpose protocols like the web itself, specific tools like Gmail, Facebook, Instagram, ChatGPT, more recently agentic coding tools, they were all freely given to start out with and to begin with enthusiastically embraced by users who delighted in them. People took up these gifts and creatively used them in ways that very often surprised or vexed their developers. The sheer social power of the biggest organizations in our digital economy might make this language of choice and participation seem like a mistake or even kind of obtuse on my part. But the growth of these services and the digital economy in general was not simply imposed on people. The tech landscape is littered with the rusted hulks of grand investment schemes and tech schemes that were a gigantic waste of time and money because people simply did not care to use them. Facebook and Meta and the metaverse is only the most recent and largest example. Those guys burned $80 to $90 billion of money for nothing because nobody was interested. So it's not as if these schemes always work. When they do work, or work well enough for most people, well then that's when things become a little trickier. Any anthropologist will immediately tell you that gifts are never really free. Tech platforms gave people useful, even wonderful tools, and the tools in turn allowed people to give mostly to each other, proliferating social networks of obligations amongst themselves, photos, thoughts, clips, memories, prayers, all accompanied by emotive reactions, ratings, resharing, all the rest of it. It all seemed worth it, at least at first. And the more people gave, the more they got in return, not just from others, but also from the platforms. More friends, more public visibility, better search outcomes, fun applications. Online, spontaneous peer-to-peer activity grows exponentially over the last 20 years. And in the background, the platforms get to peer into it and its mysteries. the idea that computers could in some sense capture and represent just the constant flux of kind of raw social life, the flow of things given and received, ordinary exchanges, every hello and goodbye, every meal that people sit down to, and all that stuff starts to crystallize as a thing. And again, the early platforms were not really aware of this. Like it took them a while to see that was what was happening. But not just every economic transaction, but every greeting, friendly chat, disagreement, joke, frown, every small bit of social existence suddenly seemed like it might be legible. And everything in the flow of ongoing social creative existence stood to be corralled and made valuable as bundles of enforceable rights, not just surveilled by computers, but taking place within them, constituted by them, on people's phones as analyzable data. And so the gift turned into this very dubious Mosian bargain, we call it in the book, upon which a whole commercial infrastructure arose. Now, a lot's been written about how those original gifts have turned exploitative based on market building strategies. But my focus for the rest of the talk is going to be on one of the consequences of all of this. I'll argue that the Ordinal Society is predicated on the maturation of a distinctive conception of the individual now, someone who is at once deeply expressive and tightly controlled. The machinery of ordinalization attends carefully to individuals rather than coarse classes or groups. And by doing so, it seems to, or promises to, liberate people from the constraints of their social affiliations and to judge them for their distinctive qualities and contributions. Again, this is something that's often kind of underestimated. The idea that behavioral data that is a record of the things that you did implies that you could be judged for things that you did, not things that are associated with the class of people to which you belong, for example, but your actual actions and your real thoughts. And so by doing so, it seems to, it has this emancipatory promise kind of built into it that people seized on. It promises incorporation for the excluded and recognition for the creative and just rewards for the entrepreneurial. And yet, this emancipatory promise is delivered through systems that classify, sort, and above all, rank people on a previously unimaginable scale in both senses. And so the resulting social order is a kind of paradox where there are these constant tensions between personal freedom and social control, between the subjective elan of kind of inner authenticity that we experience and the objective forces of external authentication. And it gives rise to a certain way of being, we think, a sort of self whose experiences are defined by a push for personal autonomy and the pull of platform dependency. In The Road to Serfdom, Hayek warned that government control of the economy would destroy individual freedom and eventually lead to tyranny. Our predicament is different. Tyranny may come instead from digital platforms that enhance individualism and interpersonal communication to such a degree that our ability to form meaningful social bonds with one another has been fundamentally altered. So we can argue that we're traveling down a kind of road to selfdom, where we must cultivate and attend to distinctive digital identities that represent us in the world and develop our own understanding of it, and hope to harness technology to carve out spaces of kind of personal sovereignty and domination. So the first step of 3 in this road to selfdom is the changing character of privacy. To be a legitimate self these days, you have to be identifiable, authentic, and increasingly authenticated. The second step is in the domain of expertise. There, widespread information access has produced largely self-reliant individuals who distrust established sources of authority and experts and generate their own knowledge. And the third step is in the public sphere, where the simultaneous celebration of authentic, differentiated identities and their mobilization through algorithms creates emotionally charged but socially disconnected selves who often resist traditional forms of collective solidarity. And that vacuum gets filled by more personal forms of political communication and action. So let me take each step in turn. So first, authenticity and identifiability, being visible to the system. In the early days of the internet and later the web, pseudonymity wasn't just common, but it was kind of celebrated both out in the world and in the academic literature as a sort of liberating feature of this new way of interacting. Right? Internet users embraced the creative possibilities of multiple identities and of digital personas, decentered identities. That's Sherry Turkle's phrase from Life on the Screen, one of the early kind of very influential studies in this world. Offered new forms of play and self-expression, where the ability to experiment with different versions of yourself was a real feature of being online. And it also reflected the technical architecture of a less integrated internet. That gave participants what you might call interstitial liberty. And that's the liberty kind of granted by gaps between systems that will not or cannot effectively talk to each other. It's a kind of negative freedom. If your gaming profile can't easily be linked to your professional email or your forum discussions, well, then you enjoy a form of privacy that depends less on explicit legal protections and more on the technical limitations of systems that are connected in principle, but they're not really integrated in practice. But as the gaps between these systems have closed, and as virtually every online service asks you to create an account, and the rise of identity providers as a kind of layer in most online activities has really consolidated, a high baseline of visibility is now the kind of expected state of things. And so the very act of trying to kind of maintain anonymity to escape the digital mesh becomes grounds for suspicion. The sociologist Janet Vertesi had a nice example of this about 10 years ago with an informal experiment where she tried to keep the fact of her pregnancy off, it's a secret to the internet. You may be familiar with it. By using cash to pay for things wherever possible, asking her friends and family not to talk about it on social media. And then the most telling moment in the experiment comes when her husband tries to convert $500 in cash into an Amazon gift card to purchase a stroller. And the pharmacy informs him that that kind of cash-to-card transaction has to be reported to the authorities. And so the message is clear, right, that automated surveillance of transactions is normal on the one hand, and trying to evade it makes you look like a criminal. Sometimes the preservation of these gaps is a technical limitation, and then at other times it's a much more directly political choice. Until recently in the United States, undocumented immigrants were safely able to work and contribute to the tax system, and then that deliberate administrative separation allowed US businesses and governments to benefit from immigrant labor while also creating a functional sanctuary where millions could fulfill their tax obligations with individual taxpayer identification numbers without fearing that it would trigger deportation proceedings. And then DOJ decided to change all of that. This is also the liberty that shrinks further when private companies are suddenly pressured to share their data with the state, as happened in China around financial credit scoring in the recent past, or when, again, US government agencies decide to scrutinize the social media profiles of visa and citizenship applicants. Closing those technical gaps and fusing data from market and state institutions not only makes surveillance much more pervasive, it makes it more powerful. And so tools that recognize patterns and predict behaviors and detect anomalies can now work across previously separate domains. Again, they don't have to work perfectly, they're just working that way, and then people suffer the consequences. And so today, staying anonymous requires an elaborate series of countermeasures, whether that's through the effort to pass legal measures, like the right to be forgotten, or technical solutions like virtual private networks or something. And again, in a world, though, where digital presence is expected, where your virtual avatar is meant to be out there, protecting your privacy can make it seem like you have something to hide. And maybe you do, right? There are all sorts of potential embarrassments or vulnerabilities in the data about you. And proving your blamelessness is a near impossible task, if you get right down to it. Now, identifiability is just the first threshold in establishing a digital personality. The more crucial question is one of authentic identity. Who are you really? The ordinateurs want to know. To help us unlock this information, they transformed it into a matter of public record to be shared publicly, proudly, and widely. Social media companies, in their expansionary kind of growth phase, something that may be changing, which I'll mention at the end, skillfully exploited our thirst for human sociability and our romantic ideals of self-realization. They relentlessly encouraged individuals and organizations too to publicly express their true selves, their core commitments, their basic values, and enroll allies to validate them in public. And that compulsion to authenticity frequently backfires. Being exposed as inauthentic can be devastating to people's reputations and livelihoods. And again, we can think of these sorts of examples happen across many different domains. One example, the sociologist Angèle Costin has described savage online battles between vegan influencers who push the envelope of vegan purity and then expose their rivals as secret meat eaters. Other authenticity traps are more ominous, right? It's when organizations use social media feeds as public proof of who you truly are. An agitator, a gangster, a covert terrorist. The Trump administration's reliance on tattoos as one easily harvested, measurable piece of evidence of gang membership takes an often superficial marker, perhaps misinterprets it, turns it into a data point in the deportation system, for example. Authenticity traps multiply in other ways too. Generative AI increasingly blurs the boundaries between real and synthetic texts, images, and sounds. Traditional concerns about inauthentic or misinterpreted performances online, of the sort that Kieran discusses, or that Forrest Stewart talks about in his work, have given way to more fundamental questions about truth. Hopeful startups raise billions of dollars to develop cheat-on-everything AI tools. Job seekers can artificially generate their own job market materials, fake their job interviews, even on video. You're all trying to figure out how to deal with this stuff right now in the classroom. And in the aggregate, it has the effect of shifting the emphasis from authenticity to authentication, from demonstrating the truth of one's identity to proving the reality of one's testimony. The question is no longer whether an identity is genuine, is that really you? Or even authentic, is that the real you? But whether each element of your digital presence is unmediated by something like artificial intelligence. Is that really you? So this emergent regime of authentication transforms interactions from a set of performances to be judged by real people into a series of actions to be verified by machines at every step. And so being a legitimate self now requires you to be publicly identifiable, authentic, and increasingly fully authenticated. And what began as a celebration of individual uniqueness avidly encouraged the production of kind of digital representations of that, of your true self, is evolving into an elaborate system of verification that will treat any trace as a potentially suspect record. And then as fake versions of ourselves start to circulate, we may soon find ourselves caught in sort of endless cycles of proving and defending the reality of our own existence, submitting ourselves more and more to a machinery of institutionalized skepticism that would have repulsed the early internet's champions of identity play and experimentation. This leads to dilemmas small and large, and our ironies small and large. Here's a small one spotted last year by Simon Willison, where Anthropic is recruiting and would like an essay from you, but please don't use AI to write it. The phenomenon, though, is quite general. Here's an example closer to home from just yesterday. Eric Topol is at Scripps. He's like a big best-selling diet and longevity guy. And here's a case of a fake paper with he's the first author on it, where the authors did a fair amount of work. They got the Zenodo registration and a DOI for it and everything. This one got shut down pretty quick, but of course it happened partly because Topol himself got wind of it and called it out publicly. The political and technical crises of authentication extend well beyond individual cases like this and well beyond the individual self. As can be seen just in that last paper, knowledge itself has massively expanded and diversified, but it's also become more bespoke and more parochial in the process as people interact with the web in ways that build upon and further elaborate sort of their own personal convictions and representation efforts. And again, the advent of generative AI possibly worsens that epistemic challenge. When everything must be authenticated, but fakes get more sophisticated all the time, how do we know anything? If you had come across that paper, how would you have been able to tell that he didn't really write it? And we live in this era now of disintermediated knowledge. And we shouldn't lose sight of how stunning and remarkably empowering it is to be able to just download and analyze massive data sets, look up original legal documents, perhaps have an AI assistant help you write code to analyze them, and so on. It really is amazing, and people love it on the whole. And for all of its problems, if you asked sort of academics across the board, would they go back to a fully pre-digital, pre-network world of knowledge sharing, of academic communication, of data availability? The overwhelming answer is absolutely not. They wouldn't do it. But this transformation in everyday work has been accompanied by something else. The disposition to search has quietly become second nature. And so doing one's own research is more than just the habit of academic professionals, right? It's a kind of moral imperative that's diffused much more broadly. And academics are kind of repulsed when they see people using that phrase online, but it's a sort of civic command, and it's a little like being a good driver. It's a skill everybody thinks that they have. Individuals equipped with the capacity to search the network and query large language models, in possession of the self-confidence and the means to broadcast their findings, tend to become authoritative sources of opinion. At least that's how it seems to them. And so we can also understand why knowledge produced in that manner is often so emotionally charged, in a way that's not that different from the way it's emotionally charged for us as academics doing our own research, but really because we're academics. The more people invest in researching and developing their own understanding, the more their pursuit of knowledge transforms into a kind of personal revelation, where everyone is both the seeker and interpreter of their own truth. And so what begins as an exercise in independent reasoning becomes a matter of belief. And belief defended all the more passionately because it seems to have been self-discovered rather than externally given. So in consequence, traditional hierarchies of knowledge and sources of expertise, people like us, find themselves bypassed in favor of self-piloted algorithmic searches that generate a precisely relevant answer to a query or a prompt or a summary of a paragraph of text. And again, at its best, right, this kind of thing tends to a sort of Deweyan democratic ideal, revitalizing knowledge production as a distributed and participatory enterprise, making it work in a democratic spirit of open inquiry and collective truth-seeking. That's what many hoped for, too, in the early days of the World Wide Web, up to and including the first waves of social media from blogging to Twitter. At its worst, though, the distribution of knowledge ends up channeled through platforms that mass personalize results and promote engagement with extreme or misleading content because of its shock value, and its pandering are what produce advertising dollars. So by now we're drowning in examples of tech platforms wielding market power to bend information ecosystems to their business needs, regardless of societal consequences. Google revolutionized search by, in effect, treating web pages as a huge reputational network. And the relative authority of sites was set by a wider world of independent choices to link to pages or not. But the desire to tailor results to individual preferences increasingly became guided by the effectiveness of clickbait or ad placement. And that's led to a fragmentation of the knowledge that people can access. And it's now produced to facilitate market manipulation by catering to pre-existing beliefs. And so that makes the work of integrating a sort of shared sense of reality for everybody much harder. Even the very idea that we could arrive at broadly accepted consensus of facts, regardless of their content, has grown more remote. Just watch Senate hearings, if you want examples of that. It's down these knowledge sinkholes that the sense of selfdom gets further elaborated, sometimes in tragic ways, through the belief that the self is the only true source of its own enlightenment. So that combination of epistemological self-centeredness and hyperconnectivity makes people susceptible to diffuse forms of super sense-making, to borrow a phrase from Hannah Arendt. Seeking some meaningful truth, people search for significant clues scattered across the internet, using commercial algorithms, recommender systems to connect disparate pieces of information that they venture upon into some sort of coherent worldview. And what may begin as a kind of playful exercise can easily crystallize into reality-bending beliefs that thrive and foster on new social types and politically potent associations. At its peak, for example, QAnon exemplified the interactions between the searching disposition, digital mediations, and for-profit targeting. Its members saw themselves as critical thinkers, uniquely equipped to discover hidden truths and interpret Byzantine clues. And they ferociously denied being part of a cult, since, as one of them put it to the researcher, Peter Forberg, no cult tells you to think for yourself. Now, one might think or hope that the advent of LLMs will counter some of these tendencies. Maybe if they're properly integrated with a search engine or backed by the right database or properly trained and harnessed, an LLM might distill kind of vast amounts of information into a coherent response that doesn't pander. And it can certainly provide seemingly authoritative studies or of summaries of information, things that look like answers, through its inner workings, even though its inner workings remain essentially opaque. And if not answer, then why answer shaped? It's not out of the question that this might work out. My colleague Chris Bale, for example, has some optimistic work on this front, trying to get LLMs in the political sphere to nudge people back to kind of consensus reality, depolarizing them, is his hope, by acting as kind of discourse dampers, kind of counterweights. But then again, we've also seen well-publicized pathological cases where LLMs indulge and encourage people right up to the level of psychosis or self-harm and beyond. One thorny problem on this front has to do with sort of some current features of LLMs. A paper from late last year from some OpenAI researchers makes this point quite nicely. The core of it is that LLMs have a really hard time saying, I don't know. The paper discusses how this has its origins in pre-training and why it persists in the face of attempts to eradicate it in post-training. One of several forces pushing it in that direction is the way that benchmarking consistently rewards providing an answer over saying, I don't know, during the training period. Now, of course, this might improve or be solved in the future, and there are ways that it can be more or less mitigated. And I'm always leery, kind of just as a social scientist, to bet against, I'm not going to say these problems can't be solved. But right now, it is kind of built into LLMs that they tend to overcommit in this way. And in addition to that, their harnesses are very much geared towards pleasing the user and the user's dispositions. And people don't like it when AIs push back against them and argue with them. They much prefer it when the AI is a little more compliant and pushes and moves them in the direction of their wishes. And so in a way, the HAL we've ended up with can be unreliable, kind of like the old HAL, but for like the opposite reason. Yeah. So what happens when authenticated, epistemically egocentric selves enter the world of politics? This is the last step. If you're an authentic, self-directed individual, your greatest cultural fear is being swallowed up by mass society, just as your greatest political fear is surveillance by the state. And those fears are still very much with us, but in a world chock full of kind of socially recognized categories and authenticated identities, new dilemmas present themselves as well. On the individual side, everything, public behaviors, statements, metrics, can potentially become a source of difference and thus of identity. These are where new identities come from, is exactly in these gaps. And they're becoming more and more sort of fine-grained. And on the organizational side, the data that users generate will lump or split people in increasingly specific, fleeting, often incomprehensible ways. The more precise that social classifications become, the more opportunities arise for distinctions, moral distinctions, and moral judgments. The main casualty, I think, is the possibility of kind of broad-based, stable, solidaristic political alliances across different large categories of people. And the more citizens are treated individually as objects of market intervention, the more disaggregated politics gets. And so traditional voter targeting, for example, begins with a political message and then sought out individuals receptive to it. But the rise of streams of behavioral data kind of inverted that logic. You start instead from the dispositions that you find in the electorate, and you build resonant messages up from there. And modern political campaigns have tried hard to capitalize on this. Social media generated data about cultural practices, emotions, beliefs, about a wide range of subjects, help craft new narratives, new aesthetics, memes that reshape people's informational environment and activate their votes at strategic times. And so what we end up with is a kind of architecture of personalized messaging and repeated exposure. But the focus isn't on persuading individuals or even collecting their views. It's on sort of triggering desired behaviors. Facebook's ad platform is a nice example of this. It finds patterns of successful actions, of likes, of donations, of purchases, of shares, and then it targets similar users who can be induced to repeat those behaviors. So it's trying to generate categories out of this kind of inductively. And each interaction helps refine its models, creating an ever more granular map of manipulable targets who will reliably respond for now. And so the resulting political formations have a very kind of ad hoc, emergent ad hoc quality. They're kind of people without groups, somewhat independent from traditional mediating bodies like political parties and social movement organizations. And so the weakening of these conventional structures and the ability to individualize political messaging also produces highly personalized forms of social power. Populist leaders thrive on perceptions that they have a direct connection to the public, even though this connection is often attended by an entire ecosystem, a carefully constructed feedback loop of popularity. And if you're the owner of a social media platform, then you can try forcing that connection onto users via self-serving algorithmic manipulation, as Elon Musk and Donald Trump have both reportedly done on their respective platforms. And if you're not, if you're merely fabulously wealthy, then intoxicated by the ideal figure of the sovereign individual, unconstrained by national borders, social norms, or the law, a small cadre of kind of ultra-wealthy men have been able to reclaim control over the state and traditional elites through a direct appeal to the masses and to market freedom. Pushing the logic of sovereign individuality to its extreme, some are busy trying to carve out independent territories for themselves, complete with their own rules, possibly their own currencies. Others invest in revolutionizing existing institutions from the inside, as with the case of Elon Musk and Doge, hoping to oversee a radical remaking of the state into a centralized, largely automated computing infrastructure, at once extremely powerful and wielded by people with little to no experience of or interest in governing, as we conventionally think of it. Most people have to work harder. The digital economy is full of rags to riches stories built in the back of technical systems, encouraging every teenager to compete for and capitalize on online fame. But the rules of these games are kind of twisted. Money, time, and social capital play a big role in propping up some individuals over others. And this economy rides on payments via algorithmic boosters, ancillary supports for production and advertising, including bots, who can relay the message both inside and beyond online spaces. And then the rise of self-branding, little mini-sovereign individuals, is in part a mark of sort of desperation. The often missed point about sovereign individuals is that not everybody gets to be one. But everybody should aspire to be one, and in the meantime, to follow one on social media as they walk down the road to selfdom. One final point about the changing character of what we call social media in this world. The thing about it is that it's increasingly less and less social. Social media distilled and leveraged what we think of the core features of the web itself. It was public. It showed user-generated material on a social graph whose metrics were themselves visible in the form of liking and sharing, of upvotes, and so on. And that's what helped build out, in the sphere of culture, much of the infrastructure that we now sit inside. It was the widespread acceptance of the Maussian bargain, kind of in this area, that helped create the tech giants that dominate things at present. But things are changing. This is not a static environment. Over the past few years, there's been a steady shift in what we might call the social basis of social media. What used to be public is now more likely to be in some sense gated. And I don't just mean in terms of on a platform, but something semi-public with more of a fire break between itself and the open web, or between itself and the rest of the platform. Things like Discord, for example, where a lot of activity has retreated into into these quasi-public spaces. What used to be user-created is now increasingly likely to be generated in two senses. First, in the sense that established stars and their content farms have pushed things to a more broadcast and consume model. And second, in the sense of the rise of AI-generated content, of slop, which is, for now, recognizable as such to sophisticated viewers, but is increasingly difficult to confidently distinguish from something real. On top of that, what used to be content based on your social graph has more or less been replaced on most platforms by content from those broadcast sources. It's been replaced essentially by what people see on Instagram or Facebook, for example, is no longer content posted by their friends. It's the algorithmic feed, which tries to guess what it is that you like. And TikTok pioneered that, and everybody followed it. And if you're a casual user of Instagram, it's much harder than it used to be to just see what your friends are taking a picture of. Like, the platform isn't that anymore. And then finally, how those predictions are being made has shifted away from patterns of likes and shares, where we'd see what was trending based on active choices, conscious choices made by users, towards measures that are still behavioral, but which are in the category of kind of user telemetry. That is, feedback via the app on things like, did you pause here? How long did you sit and look at this? How many times did you let this loop play? Did you scroll back up? Those kinds of things. The other part, of course, is the brutal fact of cohort replacement. The shift that I've just described there is not uniformly distributed across platforms, and platforms are not uniformly distributed across age cohorts. So the Ordinal Society is not a particularly optimistic book, but I do want to emphasize that we're not trying to describe an endpoint or an inescapable state here, right? This is a sort of social form that is totalizing in one sense. It's pervasive, but not in the sense that it's here forever or literally inescapable. But it's the shift that we think is real, and the answers to questions about who benefits and what is the basis upon which you orient yourself towards answering questions like, who am I online, and what is my identity, how do I prove my existence, those kinds of questions. That's where the transition has happened. When he wrote to IBM France in 1955, Jacques Perret had one slight reservation. He said, the downside is that ordination also refers to a religious ceremony. But he immediately added, the two fields of meaning, religion and computing, are so distant that the inconvenience is perhaps minor. But Professor Perret was more correct than he knew. In the 70 years since he baptized it, the descendants of the IBM 650 have indeed taken on quasi-religious functions in modern society. They authenticate our souls. They see our innermost truths. They shape our search for meaning in a disorienting and fragmented world. And they foster new forms of political communion and sectarian schism. And they empower the sovereign individual, the embodiment of modern selfdom, served by the ordinateur's ruthless logic and its power, while it lasts, to manufacture gold out of bits. Thank you very much for your time today.
All right. So we can open the floor for questions.
Am I?
First, thank you. If I had to rate this talk for my friends, you would get 5 stars. Really, really spectacular, and I can't wait to read the book. So I have a 2-part question. And the first is about the kind of model of social organization underlying the story, which I kind of get the impression is sort of like an assemblage model where these things happen over time. Some of it's intentional, some of it's not intentional. And I have a lot of sort of sympathy for that. I'm curious, though, whether what the role of movements and counter movements, both kind of social and technological, are in shaping this society. So that's part one. And then part two is about the temporal dimension of it. So you kind of hark back to the early modern period a little, but basically your argument is this is a post-World War II development. And given the small amount of time that is in the grand scheme of the history of humanity, how does that shape what you think is going to happen next?
Okay, right. So first, political movement. Well, the last part of the talk was trying to sort of draw out some of the ways that what we think of as conventional social movements, which are in many ways kind of intrinsically kind of cross-cutting organizations, where you're just like, this is the one kind of identity that, this is the thing we're advocating for, and across all people in this very large category, there's so many ways we could split this group up, but we're not going to, because we're in this very large group, and that's the kind of classic sort of modernist mode of political mobilization, and we think that's under a lot of pressure given on both sides, both kind of because of the if you like, on the supply side, because of the way that it's so much easier to create for yourself extremely fine-grained identities that fully exploit sort of the division of labor that everybody's in and the division of preferences, right? And so that sort of makes it harder to, it opens up space for kind of the narcissism of small differences, preventing sort of solidarity from being generated for purity wars in little tiny areas, right? We call that sort of kind of groups without people, that there's people kind of saying, I'm in this category, but there's basically nobody else in it, kind of with me. That's on one side. And then on the other side is just the sort of the tendency for, again, conventional social movement organizations, which we know, from a long history of research by social movement scholars, require a tremendous amount of organizational work to generate the kind of outcomes and collective kind of activity that, and benefits that they produce politically, are sort of under pressure from the sort of populist leader machinery and kind of inductive targeting of fine-grained kind of reactions that lead to, that sort of cut out that middle layer of kind of organization. And there's it's something that's true not just of kind of social movements broadly conceived, like of the traditional SMO type, but also of kind of political parties in many Western democracies, which find themselves increasingly unsure of who it is they represent exactly, and at the and the rise of kind of the broad rise of populism across the world can partly be understood in terms of parties being unable to corral that and channel it, and instead getting repeatedly blindsided by, oh, we need to react to the latest sort of set of outrages. So that's what I would say is happening there. It's not, again, it's not that sort of there's no scope for that kind of organization anymore, that there's no possibility. This is not sort of some deterministic kind of either or argument, but it's just much harder. It's always been hard to do that sort of mobilization. It was harder in an earlier period for different reasons, largely having to do with sort of things like access to the public at large, getting on television, and there was a much more gatekeeping kind of model of what it meant to assemble and present yourself to the public at large. But it's hard. It's harder now and in a different way than before, which is what we think justifies kind of giving it a different characterization and a different name. And then for temporality, yeah, like we don't think like, yeah, it's again, we give it we give this sort of formation a label because we do think it's real, and we do think it's a decisive shift that's happened that we can characterize and say, look, this is really a thing that we can understand and name. That doesn't mean we're stuck with it for the next 5,000 years. The general way that I think about that, and we mentioned it in the book as well, is sort of that you can see insofar as, it's like, do you have a positive message? No. Would you settle for 2 negative messages? Is that like even in the story of the rise of this whole system, what you see repeatedly is the tendency of social life, of sociality, just raw human social existence, to overflow boundaries and to not be captured fully by these sort of mesh systems and institutions that seek to control them. And you see it in small ways and large, like the very half of what we now take for granted about social media was really user-driven. Like it was users who discovered things like tweeting and like retweeting and liking and quote tweeting. That's a small example, but like Twitter was famously like just incapable of recognizing what it had. It's not like, and there was a huge amount of user innovation. The same goes for like Facebook discovering that people were saying prayers onto Facebook, and then they realized, well, what are we supposed to do with this? Or the rise of like buttons and all that kind of stuff bubbled up from the bottom, and was not sort of imposed on users, even as the firms and companies tried really hard to take advantage of it once they realized what they were just on the back of this dragon, that they were barely in control of. And so what that means is that like that's not going to change, right? That people's experiences don't fit the mold that they're given. Ongoing situations are messy. Circumstances require adjustment. The world is a noisy place. So I'm not sure what's going to happen next, but like that's why you're not. You can see it changing even now. Like there's already. Let me show you. Like just data from I was looking at this morning from the American National Election Study, and I don't know if we can get that back up, but sorry, but it's just kind of we know that there's these big shifts in social media usage. Like there you go. Like just over a 4-year period, like both in terms of partisanship and in terms of the platforms themselves. These things are shifting all the time. Because of this fragmentation, the retreat to sort of things like Discord, people go elsewhere. And so that kind of creates opportunities for shifts. It doesn't change, like Discord still sees everything everybody on that platform does. So it's not like that has gone, that's not going away because I think smartphones aren't going away anytime soon. But it does mean that there's like a lot of room for what this might look like. And we're not sure what that's going to look like. It's not a deterministic or a static process.
I'm going to take initiative and ask the next question. So I have a question, sort of building off of Matt's. So you answered the time question, but I have a question about scope. So you didn't title this "The Rise of Ordinalism."
Mm-hmm.
This is the Ordinal Society, and it reminds me of back when Ulrich Beck's Risk Society came out. Dates me a little bit, but okay. And there was a kind of inherent ambivalence, I think, in his work about whether he was describing a kind of emerging set of practices or whether he was describing a new world. And I sort of see the same thing going on in your work. There's a kind of ambivalence here. Is this a kind of emergent phenomenon? Or are you describing something that is fundamentally different in kind of social order, such that we really have entered now the Ordinal Society?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and it's got both a temporal and a cross-sectional kind of aspect to it, like you say, and we do think this is a sea change, like the fact that sort of literally everybody in the world who can afford a smartphone now owns one, to a first approximation, is a real shift and the fact that sort of so much of what we take to be sort of ordinary social life is both augmented by and takes place through, as it's happening like now, these tools is I think that's deserving of a definite article when it comes to a transition. That said, we're not trying to say that like, well, there's only one way this can look at any given moment. J.P. Pardaguer asked us a similar question before, like where is the Ordinal Society? Because there's going to be, just as there's like a large literature on, the way I like to think about it is that just as there's a very large literature on varieties of capitalism, within the general undisputed fact that we're living in a global capitalist economy, the same would be true in this case, that the broad characteristics that we describe, we think are at the core of things are, this is how things work, and are likely to work for some time, absent some literal catastrophe, which is not out of the question. But within that, then there are lots of different niches that both whole societies or countries are likely to occupy in different parts of the world. Or this is itself an internally differentiated system, and we're just beginning to sort of think about what that would look like.
Thank you very much. This is very great. And I also, like Matt, I can't wait to read your books. Which means I also want to build my question a little bit on Matt and Sol's question. I want to learn more about how do you see like delight or delightfulness or like this affection as a social identity to play in this ordinary society that you describe, or because you also previously mentioned that we like the social history like somehow overlook the power of like delight, and also so this kind of like remind me that how do you see the affection or play in like a social mobilization or political mobilization, or help to form this social identities in this in this society of heavily datafied and digitized.
Yeah, I suppose the motivation for that thought is that there's a way of thinking about kind of the relationship that people have to technology that's very much kind of kind of Foucauldian, broadly speaking, where you're just being sort of monitored from the outside. You're disciplined by the thing. You've incorporated this sort of sense of discipline into your own mind in a way that is just, driving what you're doing. And then there's this sort of gray mechanism of sort of surveillance that's outside. And again, we acknowledge, and I was talking about it in the talk, like surveillance and platform management, all that stuff is quite real. But if you want to explain kind of why did this sort of process accelerate like a rocket over from like 2008 to it's that people love their phones and all the things that they can do with them, and I know that like again there's a strong sort of research literature that's quite that's serious about sort of how people often hate them, or that it's like sort of I always think of it as kind of Bilbo Baggins with the ring. That's if you have the experience of like when you put your phone down, you don't know where it is, and you're like, oh my God, where'd it go? And that's kind of that's not a very healthy relationship to have with a device. But that sense of delight that began in small ways with things like the World Wide Web. Just the idea, I'm old enough that like I first used the web as an undergraduate in the mid-1990s in Ireland, and just looking at like was able to go to the JPL, Jet Propulsion Lab website in Pasadena and download a picture of Mars. It's like I had no reason to download a picture of Mars, but just the idea of like I'm talking to a computer in California, and then later it's these people have web pages that you can have interactions with them, and then it's sort of I can self-locate on this through this network of satellites and see where I am. Like I already know where I am, but I can see myself on Google Maps that on my little phone, and then the next part is I can push a button here and a car will arrive and I can get into it and bring me where I want to go, and the LLMs were the next phase of that sort of, and then 5 or 6 years from now something else will be that, and that will be that is a real driver of social change and of adoption, and you can't sort of fake it. Like companies are looking for it all the time, but if there was a recipe for it, then there wouldn't, everybody would be doing it already. And so it's the main source, it's the most focused, I suppose, source of the kind of overflowing kind of that I was talking about a minute ago, that it's sort of that people will seize on things and there's no point in pretending that they don't like it, even if you might disapprove of it, or even if they sort of feel like they do it too much sometimes. And if you want to understand why it is that things like that are happening, you have to kind of at least account for, I feel like you have to take seriously the fact that people find that sort of thing delightful, because there are, and that you don't want to come up, you don't want to find yourself presenting explanations that sort of depend on people essentially having sort of, not understanding their own preferences, or just being fundamentally deceived about their entire lives. I think that's a mistake.
Yes, thank you for this wonderful talk and so many things to think over, but I'd like to kind of turn the conversation a little bit and think through connecting your work here and this sort of theoretical understanding of datafication with the other books, with the other book you've written in your work doing data analysis and data visualization, and thinking through sort of to a certain extent of like from a pedagogy standpoint of teaching about data and quantification, but then also taking into account the social side of that. So currently I'm teaching a course to history master's students, trying to get them to understand something about data from the data perspective, right?
Right.
But then also in a group like STS, like in the humanities, going, yes, be critical of it, but there is value in doing quantification, doing it correctly, doing data visualization, those sorts of things. So if you could kind of talk a little bit about bringing together those two different sides of the things that you've done.
Sure. Yeah, I don't get that question often. But I do feel it, like that connection is real. I made a joke at the start, but it's not really a joke, which is that sort of if you work with real data at all, it's terrible. Like 90% of data analysis is data cleaning, because data is a mess. And so I don't want to give the impression that, and I understand like it could be easy to get the impression in a brief talk like this that I'm imagining some system where, these numbers that are being pulled from your phone or elsewhere are sort of perfect representations or flawless in some sense. That's not what it is. It's more like the flow of numbers is real, and the use being made of them is real. Whether it's whether it just all turns to garbage in your hands is a different kind of question. So when working with stuff myself and when teaching other people, teaching students or working with students about it, I do try to bring both sides in, kind of, or we go back and forth. On the one hand, I understand the critique of quantification as a word is automatically, it's like it's a pejorative word, right? But being able to count things is really useful. Is a really useful tool. And a lot of the time, if you can't count something, you really don't know what you're talking about. Not all the time, but often. And so that part is, I find in practice, working directly with real data is a constant exercise in humility. It makes you think about what you can't see, and it makes you think about sort of what's missing. And every graduate student I work with has the awful experience of kind of getting excited about some data set that they've got, and then realizing just how thin it is for the thing that they want to talk about, and then figuring out kind of, well, what is it that I can do? So that part is always there. And then by the same token, when I said that we wouldn't go back, I really meant it, because the ability, the example I go to a lot is sort of during the first few months of the pandemic, when everything was a disaster and we were all shut up in our homes, and we're trying to figure out what's going on, and everybody's disconnected from one another, and the people were standing up. The World Health Organization and the CDC at the time, and other organizations were standing up sort of streams of data on infection rates and mortality and death counts, and you could and then both Apple and Google then released sort of anonymized versions of data on like activity in cities, from their maps data essentially. And I could sit at my kitchen counter and just pull down like millions of rows of data and get a picture of what was happening around the world. And I wrote a little thing about it at the time, like as if that was like a reasonable thing to be able to do in your kitchen. Just like sit with a laptop and pull down like 60 million rows of data and get a real sense of like what's going on in Karachi versus in Brasilia, and what's happening in Mexico City and what's happening in Dublin. Like and again, not that you can see everything, but a little like with AI, if you don't find that sort of, not everybody has to like that or want to do it, but you should see the point. Like if you don't think that that's kind of impressive, I don't know, what are you impressed by exactly when it comes to sort of data, right? It's not that that's not the only way to see the world, but it's a powerful device, and when you work with data in that way, and you think critically about, as I hope I do, think critically about how all this stuff is being put to use. Yeah, you're constantly going back and forth between those two perspectives of like, well, it's amazing that I can see this. Okay, now what am I not seeing?
So we have Leora online.
Hi, thank you so much for this talk. I'm really, really excited to read the book. And I have a question that I'm almost annoyed at myself for asking, maybe also related to Saul's question, and interested in how we might think about a historical moment characterized by the Ordinal Society as different from others. I'm thinking about how frequently the kind of moral imperative to self-making is characterized as a neoliberal one, engendered by kind of the pressures of reduced public resources. And of course, this is a term that exhausts itself so often. But I'm curious how you would characterize the distinction between that often described sort of moral imperative to make the self and the Ordinal Society's pressures that you describe.
So how I would kind of characterize it, like what I think its content is, or
how do you think they're different?
So with this sort of thing, right, with as opposed to sort of a more kind of neoliberal picture of,
yeah.
Well, yeah, it's not that I don't think that term has analytic utility. It does tend to prejudge outcomes a little bit. I mean, it's meant as a tool. Let me see if I'm trying to see if I fully understand the question. I don't want to mischaracterize what was asked. The idea that we have here definitely has a kind of component of like people want to make money off of these authentic expressions of yourself, but in that sense it's kind of there's pressure upon people to integrate themselves into that's in part that's the kind of being visible to the system bit, like that that's I suppose that's the place I would begin is that if you're not if you choose not to make yourself visible in the way that the system wants, which is very much founded on monetizing you eventually for a lot of what you're doing. Well, then you pay an increasingly large price by so kind of isolating yourself, and the price you pay is now, maybe this is where the distinction is not just in terms of your access to kind of market opportunities or various kind of market situations that you might find yourself in as a little self-propelled neoliberal actor in the market, but also you pay a price in terms of your access to other people in a much more sort of social sense, because that's where all your friends are, or that's where all, many of the people that you know are. And so that's not so much captured by the kind of first part. The idea that, again, this is a sort of fundamentally social and kind of world, and that people's desire to participate, and half of the delight that they felt by participating was not sort of in the vertical sense of kind of I'm looking upwards to these systems and doing well by metrics in the abstract, although that's not nothing. It's also in the horizontal that I'm connecting with people in a way that I find that I want, and that is sort of social. And so that's the but in order to do so, there is this kind of strong imperative in a system like this that you if you want to be in that world, which most people do because they want to talk to people that they know or get to know people like them, you have to be visible in the ways that I described in the talk.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. I'm here thinking of that through the presentation, I could understand kind of the mechanics of an ordinal society formation, as if you were showing us the pillars through which this ordinal society comes through. But then with your metaphor, bringing religion to the conversation, I was thinking of, okay, what is the God behind that, and how your book is approaching this God, right? Because if we take seriously your metaphor, there is an order in this world, and through religion, there is some entity behind it, which some areas of science is trying to understand, right? So my question is, what is the God behind this ordinal society? How do you approach it, and how we should understand it?
Right. I think in that sense, even though a lot of our argument is kind of like Weberian in a way about how stratification positions and so on open up, but then this part is kind of Durkheimian, that the God is the individual, and a particular model of the individual, this sort of sovereign individual idea, which is the kind of person that the system is wanting to exist, wants best to exist and thrives most. And it's sort of polluted by the fact that the people at the top, we had like Alex Karp and Peter Thiel and Musk and all those people, they would like to embody that picture of supremacy in a direct political sense, that they would like to be the representatives of this image of a kind of sovereign individual, which is for them essentially cognitively gifted, sort of unconstrained, sort of quasi-Nietzschean sort of picture of a super person that is sort of unconstrained by many of these kind of social rules. But for them, the irony for those guys is, in addition to everything else that's terrible about them, is net of that. Is sort of they also are kind of bound back into the kind of logic of ordinalization, which is Musk wants people to like him. He wants to be sort of the focus of that kind of love and affection in a kind of quasi-religious manner. He wants to be sort of and to the point where he'll kind of mess up his own algorithm in order to do it, right? And so there's something kind of strange about that in the context of, so it's not enough for them to just be kind of in political authority. And then the rest of the way down the scale, you have kind of little versions of that then kind of emerging of kind of cultivating versions of yourself to be sort of virtuously visible as a kind of good, as an individual. The avatar of you that exists online that you cultivate and take care of is a small little version of that kind of Durkheimian individual God, and but the thing that runs throughout, I think, from bottom to top, is exactly that this is like a social creature. It's somebody who wants recognition and validation by other people, and that even right at the top, you don't get to escape that, and that creates kind of weird distortions right at the top. But it's also a kind of feature of what it means to exist socially, kind of all through the system. So yeah, that's what I think.
Hi, thank you for that great talk. This reminds me this well-known Planter manifesto that Planter published I think a week ago. And basically what they say is, I'm just trying to read the text is just in a way of how we can point different kinds of things about AI. And in the point number 8, it says, public servants need not to be our priest. Any businesses that compensate its employees in the way that the federal government compensate public servants would struggle to survive. And there's a lot of crazy things here about the use of AI in war, how Elon Musk is using his power to manipulate different kinds of things. But also, that reminds me the idea of Carissa Bellis. She's a professor in University of Oxford. And the thing that she mentioned is the predictions are the base of human life from the perspective of the Oracle of Delphus to now, right? So she do that kind of a way of recognize this essence of human life. So my question here is, what are the connections when we think about not only in technological meanings of how can I say this? Technological meanings of the structure and the implication of society, but also the religious itself, the comprehension of a different life beyond technological means. Yeah, that is the question.
That's a big question. I'm not sure. I mean, do you mean, because it seems like it's not, you don't mean just like what's likely to happen. You mean sort of like alternative visions of what's possible for us. Because, yeah, I mean, on the first part, that Carp's Palantir, what is it with these guys in the Lord of the Rings? It's like, they really failed to read that book in any way. That Sauron is a new tool that's out recently, which is like a home defense policy, or home defense sort of smart home security thing. There's so many of these. So you have like Anduril with the Thiel, and you have Palantir and Sauron. I don't know, but Carp is also, sorry, I'm just talking off the top of my head now. Carp is also kind of a nice case for a bit like, in even worse case than Zuckerberg, for people who think, oh, all we have to do is kind of educate people in the humanities, just like, and that will solve our problems. Like Zuckerberg was a classics, guy at Harvard and loves to read about Roman and Greek history. And similarly, Carp was like literally a student of Jürgen Habermas. And although they didn't get along very well, and sort of somebody who's, a real monkey's paw moment for anybody who ever wished, this sort of German tradition of critical theory to be more relevant to public policy. Well, there you are. Now you have Alex Carp. So one of the features of that manifesto is, as a result, like you have all these weird sort of there's a residuum of that sort of training and thinking that he has that persists in those. In those statements and in that sort of manifesto that is sort of like a desire for kind of systemic order, and the necessity for some sort of, it's filtered through the kind of critical theory tradition, the German critical theory tradition, a desire for some sort of essentially kind of religious solidarity that you need. But for them, it's all kind of just, you do it by kind of purifying in a racial manner essentially the society so that everybody's the same. So I don't know, like, in terms of kind of visions for the future and visions of possibility, all I guess I would say is that we are in a sort of strange position now where, like, each of these people that are at the top of these trees, they all fancy themselves kind of philosopher kings. They write little manifestos, and they think of themselves as kind of social theorists. Thiel is like this as well, and he's going around giving lectures about the Antichrist and all that sort of stuff. And he's the one who brought the idea of the sovereign individual. That's this old book from the 90s that he sees done. And then you have like the network state guy, and they all have like these distinctive visions, and so we need, I guess we could do with generating sort of, or publicizing some alternatives that don't quite, fit these models. But it's interesting again to see kind of, I don't have a strong answer in terms of like what are the fleshed out visions or alternatives for what a sort of better version of this kind of society would look like. But it remains very striking to me that each of the people at the top of this. On the tech side, very much, it reminds me of kind of like 18th century utopians or something, that they all have a kind of vision of an ideal society, except now they really feel like they have the machinery to forcibly implement it, which is a sort of frightening, a somewhat frightening prospect, yeah.
I actually had a question, but your response to Eladio's question made me feel like you are actually talking about, like, in the Plato's dialogue from the Republic, philosopher king, then we have to tell the society a noble truth. A noble lie, sorry. So I think that Peter Thiel and Elon Musk, like people, they think that, okay, so if we have this kind of societal stratification, then we can be treated as like a philosopher king or something. But anyway, my question is, so when you're talking about the society, are you talking about the society in general, like all societies?
No.
Or
I mean, not all at once and not all at the same
Yeah.
rate. No, like I said, this is a internally variegated, definitely.
how does
kind
it
of
work
phenomenon.
for like in a theocratic society as opposed to like a democracies in United States and maybe an authoritarian state like North Korea or Russia?
Yeah, well, there's a reason those places try to keep all this stuff out, right? Which is exactly the kind of first part, the horizontal, connective, social, peer-to-peer vision that got the kind of romantic version of the World Wide Web off the ground in the first place, which is just kind of that there's real power in the sort of diffuse collective sense in communication between people in a peer-to-peer manner that's not centralized, and so I don't know. I don't presume to be kind of an area expert on the role of technology in particular societies. There's so much heterogeneity. One thing that's interesting always in these kinds of settings where a technology arrives a little later, when it's already kind of mature both in terms of its hardware and its infrastructure out in the world, is how does it diffuses in a fundamentally different way in a place as opposed to when it's essentially still being built out, and so I think that's where I would start to look, comparatively is kind of especially in places where there have been more or less effective barriers, either state-imposed barriers in authoritarian states, or just kind of economically there was previously no capacity to carry these kinds of networks, but now suddenly, these devices are much, much cheaper, wireless communication is much, much better, then you can get very different patterns of diffusion and adoption and use under those circumstances. But it's going to vary a great deal, depending on where you're talking about.
All right. Well, so we are just about at time, unless anybody has any last-minute questions. But why don't we go ahead and give? Oh.
Yeah. Okay. So sorry. I have a couple questions, but I feel like this one is especially appropriate for a closing question. So for people who want to study this ordinal society and what's going on right now, do you have any recommendations or suggestions or advice or any, I guess, roadblocks that have hit when you were writing this book?
No, I mean, well, there's so much, right? There's, well, first, obviously, you should, if you're going to study the Ordinal Society, you should cite. There's I have a thing that I sent around before about when the book came out. You know that meme with the sort of superhero guy who's like got the two buttons that he's afraid of pressing, and one is like publicize, tell people to leave reviews on Amazon and star ratings on the book review sites about the Ordinal Society, and the other one is take seriously the arguments of the Ordinal Society. So. More seriously, there's a huge domain. I mean, because the modest goal of the book was try to characterize a very large terrain, right, and try to pick out things to look for. And so on the sort of infrastructure side, you have the question on the topic of just the talk today. It's like how are these tools affecting kind of what politics looks like, and the relationship between individuals and the state, right, and how that's being transformed. That's on one side, and then. Beyond that, the other part of the book that I didn't really talk about at all is kind of the rise of idea. We had this idea of kind of how it is that your existence online as a sort of person who's in the world that is represented by these tools kind of can be characterized. We think of it in terms of what we call eigencapital, which is sort of like the metaphorically the sort of manifestation of all the digital records about yourself that get applied in different market settings to different goals. And understanding how that sort of stuff works is both of great interest to me, to Marion and myself, and also quite challenging, in part because of the very conditions that this world has kind of generated, which is essentially the increasing importance of private data. There's an earlier world where, you know, like people are getting most of their data from the state, official statistics, right, that are in some sense public. But now there's never been kind of more important kind of real data locked behind, you know, you can't get access to it, even though it's the most important stuff we need to kind of understand. And it's strange to me personally, again, going back to this question about kind of teaching about data use and working with data directly. The social sciences face this kind of weird dilemma right now where we've never had better tooling, free, open source, you know, community maintained tools, and never had better standards for reproducibility, replication, and so on, and never attached more importance to those things. And yet, there's also never been like less of an opportunity to get hold of the kind of data that we would really like to see, because it's essentially private. And so that's, I think, the really, in terms of the global challenge of kind of understanding this kind of society, it's exactly that. So much of the things that we really would really want to see firsthand about how these data sets are being used and combined and so on, we see sort of through accidental leaks or through exposés or through breaches or through occasionally people who have sort of network connections essentially into these organizations, but we never get to kind of really see the data. And so that's the challenge. It would be bad if like we could only continue to characterize what's happening in this world kind of from the outside or through its effects. And we wish we could see more into the kind of actual machinery that's being deployed in these in all of these settings. That's where the real challenge is, I think, in the long run.
All right. Well, thank you all so much. Let's go ahead and give Kieran Healy another round.
Thanks, everybody.
So at 5 today, we're going to be going to Maroon Door. Please join if you can. And then next week is our last seminar. So we'll see you then.